Good day, good people, and a special welcome back to our friends from FIRE. Today we're going to be spending a few minutes continuing our conversation on smarter planning. This is part 2 of backwards designing for all when it comes to instruction. I'm Dr. Michael Fagel-Luby, co-founder of the Learning Research Network. Thanks for coming back for this video. We're going to pick things up with smarter planning. We've already talked about selecting and mapping the critical content, and now let's get into the real art of teaching. We started off with analyzing the big important ideas for what's most difficult for our students. Now let's get into the R and T steps and avoiding the ER. We'll also talk a little bit about 6 teaching functions, a way to sort of bring these into our classroom, and different assessment pathways that we can use to help learn what it is our students actually know about the material we've been teaching. Let's get started. Okay, so if you follow from the last video, you'll see that smarter planning has these steps. We've done S and M and A. Now we're on to reaching the enhancement decisions by selecting powerful teaching devices. What would be sort of the mid step in a planning and providing instruction if you're following the Vaughan and Boss framework. Now, keep in mind, S, M, A, R, all of these things happen before a student even walks through the door of our classroom. In fact, that's why I like this model. It recognizes that to be a professional educator is to do 4 of these things before anybody, the principal, the students, the parents, the school board, ever sees you in classroom. That's what a professional educator does. So those teaching devices for us are followed by teaching explicitly the things that we need to teach. Teaching strategically with those routines in our classroom to actually help the students bring about the learning outcomes that we want. So the R and the T steps complete the smart planning process, that first component. How do I think about that? Well, one of the big questions people ask, and Don Deschler and I did some work in this area on what should teachers teach struggling readers. This includes kids who are ADHD, learning disabilities, students who are neurotypical and struggling. Well, what we found was that the most significant difference between struggling readers and their typical achieving peers is actually not what they're taught about literacy, but how they are taught. And I love the idea of the more we stretch in our classroom as teachers to meet the needs of those students, to be able to change how we are teaching, to include more pedagogical practices that provide ability level practice going to grade level practice, the more we provide corrective feedback to students, the more that we introduce key background knowledge before asking students to engage with it, the more likely they are to come along for the ride. Let me expound on those a little bit more. You see, we've got a core example here that I think you'll enjoy. Let's think about the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation a number of years ago. They were interested in doing something with the small learning classroom process that was sort of taking over schools. The issue was, hey, and by the way, who wouldn't agree, that if I could just have fewer students in my class, I know that things would be better. But what happened was they were able to fund schools, as you can see in the image, going from about 30 students in every class all the way down to 15 students in every class. That's incredible. For those of you who have 30 or more students in your class, you're thinking, woo, this is fantastic. I really wish I could have that. But what was interesting about the Gates Foundation was that they asked, if we're going to fund this research, can you actually showing us it's making a difference? What do you think happened? Classrooms had 30 students, they were cut down to 15 students, and the teachers were asked to teach the same material. What do you think happened to the student outcomes? While we all hope that the student outcomes would go up because we had smaller class sizes, in fact, that wasn't happening. Why? Because teachers were teaching the 15 students the exact same way they were teaching the 30 students. They weren't providing any more corrective feedback. They weren't providing any more ability level practice. They weren't providing scaffolding and mediated instruction to move to grade level. They weren't teaching cognitive strategies to teach students how to learn how to learn. That's an important lesson. It's not just about class size. We need to think about other variables. While we all would still love the small class sizes, what would we do with the time? I want to do a little bit of a dive here on the 6 teaching functions suggested by Anita Archer and Charlie Hughes in their book, Explicit Instruction, Effective and Efficient Teaching. There are 16 different instructional practices that they talk about as making a difference in an academically diverse classroom. They organize those around 6 teaching functions: reviewing and presenting, offering guided practice, corrections and feedback, independent practice, and weekly and monthly reviews. Look underneath the hood of each of these though. When you're starting off your class, how frequently do you review homework and relevant previous learning? How frequently do you review prerequisite skills and knowledge so that if students don't have those, you make time for them to learn them? Now, in another video on reading and reading development and on neurotypical students who struggle, we talk about how almost 2/3 of 4th graders and 2/3 of seniors in high school are reading below grade level. That means we need to use that review and instruct time early on to get them the background knowledge and skills they need. How frequently do we do that? What about presenting? Now, there's a lot of ways to present. Spray and pray, presenting sage on stage, but we're talking here is about how presentations were intended. Stating lesson goals, presenting new material in small steps, and modeling procedures for students using a think aloud as a teacher, providing both examples and non-examples in our instruction, using clear language. John Hattie will tell you that's a huge predictor of student outcomes. And I can be guilty of this, as I'm sure many of you can, avoiding digressions. How many times have you told a story in class and the students remember the story, they don't remember the content they were supposed to? When it comes to guided practice, just like presentation, there's so much more than just, I had a discussion with the students. Are you, when you think about guided practice, requiring high frequency of responses to build student engagement and keep them motivated? Are you ensuring high rates of success, that 80% of questions during student engagement of guided practice should be answered correctly? If they're not, this is your time to go back and reteach. Do you provide timely feedback, clues, prompts? You know, when somebody gives that wrong answer, do you say to them, hey, you're in the ballpark, but let me help you find your seat? Hey, you're in the right row, but let me get you a little closer. When you're doing guided practice, do you have students continue practice until they are fluent? Again, the idea of practicing something until you can't get it wrong, not just on the off chance you magically got it right. When it comes to corrections and feedback, do you look for, as I'm going to show you in a second, patterns of error so that you can reteach the whole class or small groups when necessary? Independent practice is something that we rush to just too fast in our classrooms. Block scheduling has become 8 minutes of teachers explaining the directions and then some 82 minutes that's remaining in a 90-minute block doing independent practice. Well, if that's the case, are you monitoring initial practice attempts? If students aren't getting upwards of 90 to 95% of those initial independent practice attempts correct, are you stopping and going back and reteaching? Because if you're not, then what we know about cognitive learning science is that they are practicing the wrong thing, and that's something we don't want. That's the fear for us. We need to stop and correct that. That takes us back to corrective feedback. And what about having students continue the practice until the skills become automatic? In the previous video on Smarter Planning, I talked about automaticity of being able to move from a cognitive learning strategy into not even thinking about using a strategy. This is the place where that happens. And then not forgetting that judicious review when we bring back ideas over time so that we're not just doing midterms and final exams or unit tests, that ideas have functional use in our class. Math teachers can be really good at this when they pepper assignments with both problems from the new unit as well as old units to make sure that same way of thinking is really sinking into that long-term memory. These are 6 teaching functions with particular components to them. We can also think of when it comes to how we teach about a continuum of explicitness. I really like the way that Jim Knight at the University of Kansas in the Instructional Coaching Group thinks about the continuum of explicitness. He talks about how constructivist views, discovery-based views, have their place in the classroom. And they're most useful when we want students learning focused on having their own picture in their head, sort of different from the teachers. What is it that the theme of this poem was to you? What is important about your story in an autobiography? And moving, as you can see in this continuum, all the way to a more direct instruction way of teaching, when the learning that's necessary requires students to have a clear picture in their head of what's also in the teacher's head, right? If you're teaching the nitrogen cycle, if you're teaching the water cycle, they need to know that they have the exact same cycle in their head as you. Well, that requires a more direct instruction. And so, depending on what we're teaching along this continuum, we want to think about cueing the students to what's important, actually engaging in that instruction as we just talked about in the 6 teaching principles, reviewing big ideas at the end of the lesson, not stopping 5 minutes before the end of class when you have just a little bit of material to go, but you don't actually stop and review the big ideas, means from a learning science perspective, they will have less likely to remember tomorrow what you had talked about. We don't want to sacrifice 45 or 90 minutes of instruction by forgetting to go back and do that review. Now, for some students, it's more of a not cue-do review, it's a cue-do-do-do-do review because they need lots and lots of practice attempts. In fact, it's one of the things that differentiates those struggling learners and those learners with learning disabilities from typical students who are doing well, how much practice they get. There's also 8 stages of instruction offered where you could think about pre-testing students for exactly where they are, getting a commitment from them to learn a particular strategy that you're teaching, maybe moving from a mnemonic where they memorize some steps to ability level practice, getting them to think about, all right, let's move towards grade level practice, and then some sort of planned post-testing and generalization of how could you use this somewhere else. You can hear me describing it. It's just really, really explicit. It's planful. It's exact. But it's more efficient because the students then know how to do something and move forward and use it in the content that you're trying to teach. There's no rush to get to the end of the semester if the students aren't with us. This continuum of explicitness really makes that come alive. Okay, so that's smart planning. We could be done here, but let's keep our kids out of the ER. Ha ha ha. Well, what is the ER? The ER is evaluating learning and instruction, right? We want to learn both what was the level of learning for the students and how high quality was our instruction. And then where we always need to reflect as teachers is reevaluating back at the start, the outcomes and planning, that evaluating and modifying instruction, again, from the Vaughn and Boss perspective, that connects back to, did I really select the critical content? Is that what I should have been teaching in the first place to help the students be successful? And so when we think about the ER components, I love this comic, right? I said I taught him, I didn't say he learned it. Hosp has a quote there as well. But the idea that we need to differentiate between these two. And how do we do it? Well, we do it by thinking about assessment informing our practice. Not a data as a dirty word, not assessment as one more thing we have to do, but data and assessment being meaningful so that it tells us, it measures student learning and it measures the instructional effectiveness. We want to know about students. Do they have the knowledge that we're supposed to, as well as the skills that are spelled out in our standards? We want to know if the measures of instructional practice mean that in our smarter planning model, we reached good enhancement decisions. We had good teaching strategies to help move students forward. It's kind of a joke, but the students keep moving through the grade levels when they do well enough. We as teachers stick around. We get to do it again. So if you're teaching 3rd grade or 5th grade or 9th grade or 12th grade, you can revisit your teaching strategies over time, seeing if whether or not the anticipated difficulties your students were going to have were equally met by the high quality teaching strategies that you chose. All right, that's enough on this topic. Thanks for joining us. For more on this and other topics, please visit thelearningresearchnetwork.org. Thank you for joining me.